generally speaking, the one with the most equitable balance of these elements is considered the most balanced and healthy person. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was considered to be the example in terms of the balance of these elements. And if there was an excess, because we all inclined to have excesses in a particular area, right? Some of us will be cold and dry. The cold and dry people will generally be thin, active, quick to reaction. The cold and wet people, the hot and dry, excuse me. The hot and dry people that I'm talking about initially, the fiery people, will tend to be quick to reaction, generally thin, etc., etc. And the people who are cold and wet, well, the phlegm people will be more slow in movement, more fat. Fat is cold and wet, so on. So those are constituent temperaments. That used to be a term we used common English language too. Temperament. What is his temperament? What is his constitution? What is his mizaj? So yeah, people who are hot. The interesting thing is that people find themselves, they get stuck in these particular patterns. Now, the Prophet was considered the most balanced of the human beings, and in the creation, the human is also considered in the balance of creation to be the kind of equitable balance of the elements in a very perfected, kind of very beautiful form. So earth, air, fire, and water elements come together in the human being very differently than they do in the animals. The animals tend to be more hot and dry. You know, the average temperature of a chicken is like 105, even a bird. Or dogs' temperatures, the physiologist people, you know, dog temperatures are, I'm trying to identify someone who doesn't recognize what I'm talking about. Dog temperatures are higher than human temperatures. Or look at these animals with fur like dogs and bears, and they can live out in this snowy, icy, freezing places in which we cannot. So there, and a stone, in terms of creation, or a plant is much more cold and wet than a human. They don't have as much fire. They don't have as much activity, movement. The stone, or the metal, extremely cold and dry. So the Prophet Muhammad, he was dominant in this, in blood, in the hot and wet. Hot and wet is the place of joy. It's the place of pleasure. Pleasure is hot and wet by nature. If you think about it, things that we identify as being pleasure, they tend to be kind of hot and wet in their nature, don't they? And that's not too hard to grasp that, right? And that's a quality of pleasure, yes? Hello? Yes. Like sexual pleasure, that's definitely hot and wet, right? The Prophet was strong in hot and wet, strong in the realm of blood. It corresponds to spring. It corresponds to youth. Life is hot and wet. Life is hot and wet. Death is cold and dry. When a person dies, the final state you find themselves in, all the heat is left, and eventually the moisture is left. There's no more movement. Cold and dry. Death is cold and dry. Life is hot and wet. And life, hot and wet, air, breath, blood, breath that goes to the lungs, that goes to blood, that goes to heart, that goes to circulation, being alive, breathing, joy, good nature, spring, loss of electrical connection. Okay. All right? So that's something about hot and wet. And the Prophet ﷺ, he used to, because he had an excess of blood as an element, to find balance, he would open this vein in the springtime, but only in the springtime when that element is up. And in the springtime, the warm and moist elements come forth. We feel, and the warm and moist aspect of our being comes forth the same way it does out there. Back to this thing, what happens here happens out there. The trees, twigs become tumescent. They begin to bulge. They begin to become, you know, are you watching, in New Mexico right now, they're getting a little thicker than ordinarily. They're like beginning to swell, just like they're not quite green yet, but you can see in the early stages. Do you know? I mean, and that's very sexual. I mean, it's almost, excuse me, but you know, it's like that. I mean, I'm very open about talking about sensuality and sexuality. You have to accept that. And that's, I want to emphasize and remind you that that has always been an accepted part of Islam and recognition of one of Allah's gifts to us. And only recently have the Muslims become so puritanical about this stuff. But really, in the springtime, the warm and moist comes forth like tumescence. And there's an ejaculate of green, if you will. Right? Okay? So,